that word simply seemed to be the right word at the time, which I started seeing F's in my quilt, and I started seeing U's in my quilt, and I started seeing C's in my quilt, and I wouldn't know I was doing it, and I would stand back and go, what is happening?
This is A Line Around Your Thoughts, a podcast that centers on conversations with artists, writers, musicians, and creatives from around the Inland Northwest. I'm your host, E.J. Iannelli. This week, my guests are Jane Bitz and Mickey McReynolds of the Inland Northwest Modern Quilt Guild, or INMOD for short. In conjunction with the Guild's 10th anniversary and following a group artist residency at the Hive, about 24 INMOD members are exhibiting their work at Gonzaga University's Jundt Art Museum through August 22nd. The exhibition challenges conventional wisdom about quilting, showing how it can be a medium for experimentation, improvisation, and even socio-political commentary. Jane and Mickey talk about how INMOD members incorporate other disciplines in their work, like typography, printmaking, and collage. And they also explain how they follow quilting's rules while also thumbing their nose at them. And during the lightning round, we talk about noteworthy worms and whether there's meaning behind dreams. Before that, my thanks, as always, to Mel Antuna Hewitt for her ongoing support as a Patreon sponsor tier member. You can find her work online at librobuch.com. And you, dear listener, can join Mel in helping to sustain this podcast. Find out more about the A Line Around Your Thoughts Patreon community at patreon.com/ALAYT. Then again, if Patreon isn't your thing, but you'd still like to become an episode or a season sponsor, look for the sponsorship and support opportunities on our website at alaytpodcast.com. Between episodes, you can also get updates and engage with us on Mastodon at alaytpodcast@pnw.zone, on Blue Sky at alayt.bsky.social, and Instagram at alayt_podcast. And now, on to the Rogue Heart Media studio. So welcome, Mickey, and welcome, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're here. I kind of want to start off. We were talking just before we started rolling about the article that I ended up writing for the Inlander on this exhibition, and this is how we initially connected. And the reason we're reconvening today is because there was a lot of context I felt and a lot of more avenues that we had explored during our conversation in that gallery that didn't necessarily make it into the article. And I thought these are kind of interesting things to pursue. But I have to apologize for that lead, because this is something that came up during our conversation where you said, oh, there are several grandmothers in INMOD, but these ain't your grandmother's quilts. And I used that as my lead. And then I saw some conversation online, and somebody who was a very hardcore quilter said, I have heard that so many times. So I apologize for resorting to cliche in that lead, but I felt it was apropos given our discussion. So
We did say it, and people do say it. I mean, we associate quilting with sort of old-timey times in history, or, there was a revival around the bicentennial of quilting in America, but it followed the traditional lines. It's repeating patterns and things that are from the history of quilting. So that's there.
And what is that history, or how far back does that history go? Because as I was doing that article, so much of this was a learning experience for me. And I think that's one of the reasons I was so excited about it. Again, during our discussion at the exhibition, I was talking about my recent connections with the textile arts and just this world seeming to open up. But as I was researching quilting, it seems like it was really kind of a 19th century craft that kind of got picked up. As I was trying to trace it back to the American Revolution and the early days of America, it seemed like quilting, as we conceive of it, didn't really, or wasn't really much of a thing at that point. Am I mistaken in thinking that?
I think there was a class system going on. And so in some ways there were women that either quilted or had somebody that worked for them quilt for them because fabric was too much. You know, the people that were at home, you didn't know about them doing the work, were taking their clothes and making quilts out of their clothes for the whole reason of staying warm. So, yeah, you have this sort of division of there's these really fancy hand applique types of quilts that could have really come out of more wealthy people than people like the G-Spin quilters, the black women that quilt in Alabama.
I see.
Where they're doing it with their clothes.
And something that was new to me, or a revelation to me, during our conversation as we were walking around the gallery, before this, or just when this exhibition opened, is there is a definition of what constitutes a quilt, and that is a back, a front, and then some sort of middle, some sort of batting. With that definition in mind, I was wondering if we could talk about some of those different fronts, some of those different backs, and some of the different, what that allows for, or what sort of material that allows for, when we're talking about the back, the front, and the middle that constitutes a quilt.
I think on the front, you'll find quilters that strictly use 100% cotton, and they're cotton thread, cotton batting, cotton backing. And then there are quilters more in the improv area that will use silks and cottons and corduroy and wool and combine those fabrics together in one piece. So
yeah, I think the front of the quilt is where the design normally lives, right? The main focus of the quilt is that the quilter designs or follows a design and creates a top that is meant for, if you lay it on a bed, it's on the top. And it's the sort of design focus of the quilt. And the back, a lot of times, is pieced or out of things fabrics that are not as costly maybe, or not as designed, or it's traditional to just put a muslin backing, which is a very kind of open weave, coarse type of cloth. That's a very traditional thing because, again, the origins of quilting, some of the origins of quilting are out of necessity and out of using what you have. And quilting has gone through different, eras. And for instance, in the Depression, when everyone was busted pretty much, the feed sacks and, the flour sacks were all cloth, and women would, after they used the feed for the animals and the flour that was in those flour sacks or sugar sacks, they would save the fabric. And flour and sugar companies started putting prints on the bags to attract the buyer because then they knew, and so you can actually still go and buy flour sack fabric that's been hoarded in someone's attic.
No kidding.
At like antique malls and specialty markets. So again, it's the back sort of became this other thing of sometimes you see in quilters use a part of the front that they didn't use, a block they didn't need or something like that, or part of the fabric that they had on the front, and then they just piece together a back.
And I think in the modern area, I know it's happened to me so many times where I think I'm making a back for the quilt that I've already finished, the top I've already finished, and come to find out the back is so good that it either has to become another top or it's just a quilt that I feel like, and there is a person who does this, but where they're hung in a exhibition where you see both sides, because the back can sometimes be as good as the front. So, or it's fun because you're seeing stitching on the back that's the back of a quilt, but it's still very interesting to see it. So.
And do you have a for instance of anyone who has done something especially clever with both the front and the back? Because some of the pieces that I peered behind at the exhibition, it was a fairly standard backing or a fairly conventional backing.
Were you touching those quilts?
With your permission.
Just kidding. Do you mean in the exhibit?
Well, either in the exhibition or just in general. I'm curious to know, if anyone has done something that struck you as quite clever with both the front and the back. Maybe they were in dialogue with one another.
Well, we've got a couple pretty well-known people. There's a quilter out of Canada, Judith Martin, who literally makes a front and a back, but it's to show both sides. And they're incredible. And they are hung in the middle of a space.
And when you say incredible, help me get a visual of that.
Oh, God. Completely unique, totally her own thing, all hand done. Every piece is hand pieced. Every quilt stitch is hand quilted. Oh, God, it's really hard to... She lives on a lake up in Ontario. I think it's Ontario. So she draws a lot of her inspiration from the nature she sees, and it's really incredible. So she's probably my biggest example of that. And then Heidi Parks, who's a really young quilter. She's in her 40s and, came out of I think the Art Institute of Chicago. So as an artist, started quilting, and she was kind of, I think, the first person to sort of do all her hand stitching in a way that you're seeing all the knots. You're seeing puckers. You're seeing things you normally wouldn't ever want to see on the front of a quilt. And they're amazing. Mm-hmm. And then Jo in our group, who did that piece that is a Kawandi quilt, where all her hand stitching is showing the knots. Mm-hmm. It's just, which adds beauty to it. I used to not think so. I used to think, who would do that? Because I was still making my points perfect at the time. Everything had to be just right. And now I look at those people that are sort of going out of the box and thinking, oh, that's where it's exciting.
And there was a recent winner. I think it was not this last year, but the year before last, at the National Convention of the Modern Quilt Guild, is called QuiltCon. And the winner that won Best of Show did a quilt. She does a technique called paper piecing, which is very precise. And she has a very artist's eye of how she represents things. And she saw the statue, I'm not exactly sure where it is, Nebraska maybe, of a Native American woman with a quilt wrapped around her. And it's a monumental sculpture. It's 30 feet tall or something. Mm-hmm. And she created a quilt where the front is, you see that statue from the front. And when you went around to the back, it's completely the back. And she married the front with the back so that when she quilted, the lines in that quilt, it matched front to back. So the quilting that went through all the layers didn't sort of wreck the design on either side. It was a tour de force of technical skill and beauty. I mean, she has a wonderful eye for color and just how she does these representational quilts. And they're definitely one-off. So yeah, I guess it's in what is being done by modern quilters, some of whom belong to the Modern Quilt Guild, some of whom are just independent artists out there doing their thing. And the guild, the National Guild, has a show where the works are juried in, and the panel that juries the quilts in every year is different from the judging panel. So the judging panel always has someone who's a non-quilter artist, and then someone who is a quilter, and then sort of, I think it's like a random choice for that third person, usually someone connected somehow to quilting. But those three individuals each year are the ones who choose the best of show, and in all the categories, choose the winners, the top three quilts.
Well, here's the thing. So we've defined what constitutes a quilt. And so whether you're working in a traditional language or a traditional vernacular or a modern one, it's something that has a front, a middle, and a back, even though I think there's one exception to that in this exhibition.
Yeah, the Kwandi quilt, which typically, because the women come from South Africa who migrated to India because of the weather being so warm, they did not put batting between because it was too warm to have. So they would put another layer of fabric or possibly, I'm going to guess, clothing in the center, or sometimes just those two layers. So I don't know for sure in Joe's, but I would imagine that it probably has a layer of another fabric in it. So
yeah, but not the batting that I think we
Right.
we
Not
wouldn't
for
necessarily exactly that we would associate with it.
yeah.
But we have this definition of the quilt, but what defines modern? It's one of those things that I feel like I know it when I see it. I know when something is speaking a modern language, but in quilting, what separates the traditionalists from the moderns?
So there's several characteristics that the Modern Quilt Guild focuses on. And some of it has to do with like the composition. So this concept of negative space. A traditional quilt might be made of blocks, say 12 by 12 inch blocks, all in the same design, maybe with different fabrics in each one. But those blocks are laid out in a rectangle or square pattern, and they're joined together in regular rows and columns. And sometimes, often, they have borders. In the modern quilt vernacular, I guess, the aesthetic is things are not laid out like that. There's a free-flowing kind of way of laying things out, and there's a lot of space that isn't pieced in a lot of these quilts. The piecing doesn't extend all the way across, right? And so there's these areas that are referred to as negative space where the quilting, the stitching in, the layers together is kind of the featured thing of that quilt. It's not universal, but that's one of the characteristics.
Yeah, another one is solid fabrics. So it's very common that modern quilters only use solid cotton fabric. And I mean, you saw in the show that we have a few people that still prefer to use patterned fabric, and they do an amazing job of it. Like, I don't think I could do what they do. But that's a characteristic, a lot of just solid color. They've expanded their definition a lot. Every year they seem to add more. So, like a few years ago, they added maximalism. Well, really? Because minimalism was what modern quilting was really all about. Because if you had that negative space, it was pretty minimal what was happening on that front. But now they've expanded to maximalism, which just fills that whole front. And really, we had a few pieces in there that sort of speak like that.
The other thing that they just added is a paper piecing category as a technique. Paper piecing is a line drawing on a piece of paper, and the lines on the paper become the seams in the piecing. It's kind of a technical
It's pretty
thing.
precise, yeah.
And what it creates is a way to replicate something or make sure that the lines line up just the way you want them from a drawn image.
I see.
Which is very much coming from the traditional quilting, because paper piecing has been around for who knows how long in the traditional world too. So it's about more exact points, but it's definitely now come into the modern quilt arena as well.
So what are your exclusion criteria? How would you know if a traditionalist, and maybe this has happened, if someone who, adheres to a very traditional manner of quilting showed up at one of your sew days and was like, hey, I'm here to join INMOD, what would be your inclusion or exclusion criteria?
We do not exclude. So we have people that prefer to work with felted wool and nothing else. That's what their preference is. That's very much out of a traditional arena. But we welcome them. We love them there. There are people that probably, I know in other groups I'm in, they come in as to quilt, but they might be artists first, and quilters second, and then like myself, and I think you too, quilters first, learning the art later.
Yeah, we don't exclude anyone.
No.
I think if you talk about the Modern Quilt Guild as a national organization, they filter for their show. That's why they have jurors that are members of the guild. And the jurors are anonymous unless they choose to announce that they were a juror. And if the submission process is sending in 3 photographs of your quilt, and you choose, it has to be a whole quilt picture, and then there's a focus on somewhere on the edge. They want to see that it's a finished edge. And then you can choose a detailed shot to submit. And if you can imagine being on the jury, your inbox is filling up with all these submissions day after day after day during the submission period. And they have to, thumbs up, thumbs down, maybe, right, on every single quilt that comes in. And then the jury meets to figure out what's going to be in the show because they only have a limited space.
And I'm trying to think, let's get some numbers out, because I think it's like upwards of, was it like 4,000?
It was in the neighborhood of 4,000 quilts submitted, say, for the 2026 show that was in February of this year.
And then they choose like 400 to 600, somewhere in there. So
yeah, I think there's kind of a 400 something number that they can hang in the show. So you can see that there's like a almost 10-to-1 ratio of quilts submitted to quilts admitted to that show. It's very competitive.
It's very competitive, and they have like a sideshow, and it runs through Instagram, but this last year actually showed up in a building. Am I right? Didn't they?
I think some people organized.
So, but Instagram will do a whole roundup of if you were refused. And so it's almost like its own quilt show.
Hashtag
the
QuiltCon
rejects. The rejects.
But in terms of this, whether one is a modern quilter or not, seems to be largely self-declared. I am a modern quilter if I declare myself to be, and whether or not I make it into the exhibition is another matter altogether.
It's really interesting when you ask that question, because I feel like if I look at a quilt, I can tell you if it's a modern quilt. Absolutely.
Right.
Yes or no.
Yeah. But there's a certain flouting of rules, I think, that comes with modernism. It's the traditional vernacular and some of those strictures and some of that framework. And modernism or modern quilters seem to me to be largely flouting some of that or riffing on that.
Well, it's really about breaking rules, is what it is. And, I think one of the other parts of modern quilting we haven't talked about yet is my fave, which is improvisation. And that's definitely about breaking rules. And there's tons of rules in the quilt world. When I'm in my 39th year, and I spent like 33 of them as a traditional quilter. So I understand all those rules.
And were you pretty strict in enforcing them?
Oh, well, for myself, I was very strict in enforcing myself with having everything look just right. But that's the environment that I was living in. Now I've shifted to improv, which is extremely freeing and also it's a whole different part of your brain when you're sitting. And we have, women in our group do patterns, some improv. Sometimes I feel like I need a break from improv and I do a pattern. Because a pattern is like, I can count on it. I can look at it and all I have to do is read it and do what it says. But with improv, you're using a whole different part of your brain where you literally are you're trying to figure out, what is it I want to say? Who am I as a quilter? Questions that come up that don't normally come up when you're just reading a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but I think that's a good jumping off point to talk about your work in this show, which is called Structures.
sure.
And this was something you were, if we're going to be candid, you were a little hesitant about kind of revealing the backstory to this.
Yeah.
Because it came from, I think, a pretty raw place, no?
Yeah, it did, which is interesting when you start to do your own work and kind of what you're influenced by. So this was what year am I? 26. This was last spring. Mm-hmm. I was on Vashon Island in a residency and in my studio, and just my way of improving is just to put a piece on the wall. I usually you have to have parameters. You can't just randomly say, I'm going to make an improv quilt and I have no plan. You give yourself parameters. So I said, I'm going to use mostly black and white. I want to pay attention to the lines I make and what shapes come out of those lines. And that was really the goal of that piece, totally. But I would go back to my room at night and I would look at the news, and it was really bad a year ago. Not as bad as it is now, but it was bad. And, I'd watch it and I'd say to myself, don't watch it, and I'd go back to my studio the next day and I would continue to work, and I work right up at the wall until I feel like I'm ready to sew a big section together or something.
And I think we should reemphasize that, like, this is hanging. This is not something that
right.
is, laid flat.
Yeah, no, it's usually, in this case, because I went there and hauled my things, and I took a piece of batting, which is the inside of a quilt, and I just tacked it up to my wall in my studio. But normally I have an actual solid design wall in my home that's made out of insulation board that's wrapped in batting and flannel. Mm-hmm. So I would just, go up to the design wall, and I sort of said, okay, let's do this thing in some columns and see what happens. And I just laid out only black fabric, all different sizes. And I kept adding white, and then I had these strips of black that I ran across the quilt so I could bring that gray in sort of at an angle, the little bit of gray I put in. And, I would stand back as I was my studio was a single car garage, beautiful, with heating and air conditioning. But I would stand across the room and look at it, and I started noticing some things were occurring in my quilt that had to do with my feelings about the world. You can't swear in this podcast, can you?
You can. Yeah, you can F and Jeff. I will just throw an expletive tag on it and we're good to go. Okay. That's the beauty of podcasts.
Well, I think you hear it a lot now, but I think that word simply seemed to be the right word at the time, which I started seeing F's in my quilt, and I started seeing U's in my quilt, and I started seeing C's in my quilt, and I wouldn't know I was doing it, and I would stand back and go, what is happening? And then I saw ice in my quilt, only the E was backwards, and I quickly thought, I have to change that E. I'm going to get arrested for my quilt. But it was it's fascinating how unconsciously things can become present in something you're working on, where you think you're looking at line and shape, and suddenly there's also something else happening to you in the process of what's going on in your world or the world, and it comes out like that. So it's called Structures because I think you get a sense that there are structures going on in there, but some of them are in reaction to the world events.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I like the fact that it is so maybe sociopolitically supercharged, and yet the medium itself is one that we associate with comfort. And so there's this mix of catharsis and comfort all in this piece. Yeah.
Which it's weird, but that's what happened. I have another piece at home that I haven't worked on in a while that is a really personal piece for me. And one of the things, and that came out very unconsciously, but one of the things I do love is typography. And this piece is very personal to me. I've put it together in a way that you can't really read it, but it's there. And, letters are going all different directions. They're letters, but they're going all different directions. So you can't really go, what's this about? I know what it's about, and I think I know how much I want to put out there and how much I don't want to. But it's also it's a cathartic piece.
Yeah.
So.
And it's a good mix between, I think, what remains obscured and then what might be evident even on a subconscious level.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really interested. I'd like to be a fly on the wall for everybody that walks through and is standing at my quilt. I just think...
So at the opening reception, I saw people walk up and say, did you see that? Did you see that? And they're nudging each other.
So people are seeing...
Oh, yes.
That's the thing.
That's encouraging.
The first time I saw it, I totally... I said, yeah, there it is.
So all of you go look and then let me know.
And Jane, your piece was number 26, and this was something based on, is it a quilter named Sarah Hibbert?
Right.
And this is based on a technique that she was using, which is a collage style prompt. And then you translated that collage into a quilt.
Into a quilt. So her method is to just make collages. And she's a person who's always been interested in graphic design and words, typography. Her father was a typographer. And
I find it so fascinating, too, that here we are talking about quilts and yet typography, and talk about typography is creeping in as well.
Well, and it's weird because was he a graphic? Because my dad was a graphic graphic artist.
I don't know exactly, but I know in her book she talks about her dad being a typographer.
Or something close to
and
graphic.
So she was always surrounded with his work, and also with, she was in that era of Life and Look magazines, and where there were these big printed documents that came into everyone's homes all the time. We lived through that too.
It really was a golden age.
It was a golden age.
You think Kubrick got his start in Look magazine? There's that gave rise to so many. I'm sorry, I digress, but yeah.
It's a very, it's an interesting area to come from. And so her method that she put in her book is to say that she just does a collage every morning. She said she just gets her cup of coffee and she has her little file of papers and things, and she has a standardized size piece of paper that she works on. I think it's about 8 by 8 inches. And she makes a collage. She uses a glue stick and just glues it up, and has a little brayer if she needs to, sort of stick it down well. And this was like a lifelong practice for her. Then she became interested in quilting, and she had a very traditional introduction to quilting, and she lives in just outside of London and in England. And she started to see her collages as something she could translate into quilts, but she didn't make the collage to be a quilt. She doesn't work that way. And sometimes it's just a tiny corner of whatever she designed. And so what I did for 100 Days project was do a collage every day. And this collage was just number 26 of the 100 Days.
I wondered how you arrived at that number.
And I decided I was going to try to make it into a quilt. And she has a very elaborate method of creating a grid with translucent, like a template plastic, and creating a grid and then enlarging it based on that method. And I tried it, and it just doesn't work for me. So I just looked at the small collage that I made and made some decisions about how big some of these pieces were going to be, and then based on that, cut out the fabric to create the quilt. And I started it. We actually had a quilt retreat, and I started it at that retreat and started putting it up on the design wall and figuring things out for myself, and I didn't quite complete it, but it just took some time it really became like an engineering project. And how much like the model was the quilt going to be?
Yeah.
You know, how much was I going to stick to it? And I would just stare at it and see where I had to make changes to make it look more like the original collage. And then I always, from the very beginning, knew that I was going to hand quilt it. And that's just part of my process that I really love. It's grown to the point of where I almost, if I really, really like something that I made, there's just no way that I'm going to machine quilt it. It's going to be hand quilted.
Does it feel more intimate or more personal when you hand quilt?
In some ways, yes, but I feel like I have more control because it's not this machine that goes so fast. So I have like spots in there where I can make decisions and even like tear it out and do something different. Where with the machine stitch, tearing out quilting is a labor.
Yeah.
It is hard.
The power tools allow you to mess up faster. So
Right. So many stitches in so fast, right? And so for me, also, it's just that time that I spend just with a needle and thread and the piece itself in my hands is just really important. And I don't know how to describe it. It's just even the sound of pulling that needle through and the sound that the thread makes going through the cloth and the batting and everything. It's, you know, ASMR kind of, it's a soothing thing. It's, you get into like a flow state, a Zen state from it, at least I do. Some other people would just say, I'd rather never hand quilt anything, you know. And over time, I've refined the methods and I've taken a lot of classes from people who are hand quilters. And after a while, you just find the tools that work for you because it's hard on your hands. It's a physically demanding thing to do. And if you find the right tools, it just eases all of that. So it's been a journey for me, but I love it. It's just wonderful.
It's funny that you should bring up the physicality of it because I think this is a common theme that runs throughout in the textile arts in particular. And I wouldn't say that it is denied to other media, but through the textile arts in particular. And I think that tangibility that makes you want to reach out and touch them, even though you shouldn't, it speaks to that tangibility and that physicality to not just the finished piece, but also the creation. And that seems to be a big appeal of quilting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know. At some point, I decided, well, I think what happened is I was on Instagram and one of those little, apps within Instagram that you can shoot something up into a room and make it look like a big piece of art. And I took a small quilt of mine and I shot it up in my Instagram and went, oh my God, I love that. I have to make a big one. Hence the one in the Jundt. But they're physically demanding, which is interesting. You know, if you've got big pieces, and in this case, because it's so large, it's like 68 by 73, I have a step stool. I have to be up and down and up and down. And yeah, it's physically tiring.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that your piece, Mickey, is more or less monochrome. I mean, it's black, white, gray. Your color palette, Jane, it's there, but it's fairly limited. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of pieces in this exhibition that really appeal to my penchant for pretty rainbows. And, they really cover this whole Roy G. Biv spectrum. And one of them was Big Bang, and that was Melissa Morrison. I talked about that quite a bit in the article because it is such an eye-catching piece. I think showstopper in your words, Jane. But there are some others here too. I think there's, is it Laura Snyder? She's got a piece in this exhibition that is just incredibly, just so visually engaging and so colorful that you just kind of want to lose yourself in it.
Yeah, she did a heck of a great job of picking her fabric for that piece. And while she was working on it, and we were looking at a date with the Jundt and saying, "Come on, Laura, come on, you can do it." We did not want that piece not to get in the show because it's just stunning.
Yeah, she went on a marathon quilting adventure to get that thing done.
Yeah.
So, and she really wanted it in the show too. And what I love about that quilt is it is based on a pattern. Tara Fonin is the designer. The quilt is called the Galactic Quilt, if you want to look it up. But Laura's has nothing visually that would look like Tara's quilt at all. And what I love about the quilt and the fabrics she chose is, and I had several people say this to me, is that velvet? They perceived a plushness.
Again, you want to touch it.
The texture.
You want to touch it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's just large diamond shapes composed of small strips. And those small strips are from a batik pack of fabrics that are, that do kind of have that rainbow appeal. And her decision making on that to make each of the diamonds out of one piece of that unique fabric, some of which had multiple tones of colors in them, but just to concentrate each color in a diamond and present the quilt that way. It was just, when we started to see her working on it, it was one of those goosebump moments, where you was like, oh, golly, that's amazing,
And it's so representative, I think, of something that struck me about a lot of these pieces is that when you behold them from at a distance, there's something visually remarkable about them, but they certainly work up close as well. So there's this dual stage to, I can't think of a quilt that is an exception to this, because you'll see a pattern, you'll see a swath of colors, and you'll be very much taken with that. And then when you get up close, there's so much that's going on with the stitching alone, or these different patterns that you taught me that I was not aware of, like the log cabin or the drunkard's path. And it seems like an element of modernism when we talk about maybe flouting the rules is to take these and then put a unique spin on them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. For
and
sure.
they're those shapes are just kind of universal. It's what our world is made up out of, squares and rectangles and curves and things. And so a lot of the quilt patterns, the traditional quilt patterns, were meant to represent something in the world in a very kind of abstract way.
Well, in the log cabin, the center of the log cabin was always typically red because it represented the hearth of the home.
And the log cabin is kind of square, and
it's just strips that keep building around and around. I mean, there's different forms of log cabin.
Like concentric squares.
Many different forms of it. But the typical one, the kind of original one, is the center in red, and then building strips all the way around it as you work out. So, yeah. But it's wonderful, like one of the other gals in the exhibit, Mary Brewer, who did a very painterly feel piece that was next to Jane's.
Yeah, it's like a landscape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she had log cabin in there, and it was so interesting to see what she did with it because she broke it up. And that's what's so interesting about, she's very much an improv quilter. She may take something very traditional like a log cabin, but she said, what else can I do with it here? And how can I build? I mean, I don't know her thinking when she went into this piece, but the way she broke up that log cabin to me was like, I could stand there and really look and
study it.
And be so inspired by that I want to go home and try that in some other way.
Yeah, and there's a piece where you have this kind of landscape image, and then when you get up close that you begin to see the pattern in what looks like a more patchwork approach to it.
Right.
Whereas with other pieces, it's the complete opposite. And of course, you've got, is it the wedding band? Or
the wedding ring.
Wedding ring.
It's called, the actual block, the historical block is the double wedding ring.
Yeah. And then, so you've got
And that's Christie's.
Yeah, and you've got this artist playing with that. And so there's a part of the quilt that has this scalloped edge, but then other parts that are much more rectangular. And there is kind of a tension between the two within the piece.
Yeah. And that again is another example of where the modern approach kind of tosses away the rules, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be symmetrical. If you have part of it scalloped, you don't need it scalloped symmetrically all the way around. And that quilt totally just demonstrates that. Also because Christy works in a lot of different medium, and she does block printing, and that quilt has a representation of her block printing, and I think it's a linoleum block where she stamped out the Ohio star, which is another traditional pattern, and then she cut it up. And there's a couple places where you can see the whole pattern in that quilt, but for the most part, it's been fragmented into those rings of the double retting ring. And it's just her use of materials. She uses a lot of repurposed materials, which is another thing that the modern quilt guild, I think, is kind of hearkening back to when there was scarcity. And you couldn't just go to a quilt shop and buy yards and yards of fabric for a reasonable price. And it's kind of getting that way again, where it's going to be so expensive that we're all going to be harvesting material from wherever we can get it. And Christy does that. I think there's an ethical thing behind that she wants to not waste things but she sees a unique beauty in those fabrics, in the flaws, in the literal wear of the fabric from it being used for one purpose and then put into a quilt.
And I think there, too, we have another element of modernity creeping into this where it is informed by other disciplines. So we were talking earlier about typography. And again, you wouldn't necessarily associate typography with quilting. And yet, it's certainly evident in both your pieces. And then you have this where you have printmaking that's also informing how the artist is approaching the quilt.
Yeah. Like every creative endeavor, it's vast. It's not a large group of people. It's the Modern Quilt Guild, the official membership is around 16,000 now.
And that's the national.
That's
The
over,
national.
Well,
And
it's
there's
international.
there
It's
is a-
over. It spreads over many, many countries.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And there is then a national one and a state one?
Well, no,
No.
not really for
No, there's a national. Well, it's really international now. It's out of LA is where it started
Oh,
by
okay.
like 3 women. And it's just grown like crazy. And we're like a chapter is what it's like. We're like a chapter of the main guild.
I
so
see.
we're
local city type.
we're
chapter.
actually a 501c.
501c3.
I know, but I'm trying to think of the
A
word.
nonprofit?
Charitable.
Nonprofit,
Yeah.
thank you. We're actually a nonprofit under their umbrella. They're also a nonprofit.
I see. And so INMOD itself has about 40 members, and there are, 23 who are represented here, or 27 who are represented with discrete pieces?
There's 24 quilts, and there is our tile project, which represents, we've got 25 tiles. So
There's probably an additional, I'm going to say 7 or 8
additional people that may not
that
have
just have a
an
tile.
actual quilt in there, but have a tile.
And are you seeing more interest in INMOD? Have your numbers stayed relatively stable? I know that when we were in the gallery space, we were talking about all the myriad effects of the COVID pandemic and how that that left some people longing for the kind of collaborative nature of quilting, but quilting was also something that you could do virtually as well. And so it was kind of a creative renaissance in some ways because people were taking virtual classes with very, very famous quilters.
Yeah. I mean, I was kind of known as the person going out there and taking a class on Zoom from everybody I could find. And then lots of times I would bring them back to our group and hire them to teach a class for our group. And that kind of held us together during COVID because, really, we were fairly small then.
I would say less than 30 for sure. Maybe
yeah.
only in the
And
low
then,
20s.
And then maybe 8 people, 10 people would be at a so day. And some people didn't like the Zoom idea, didn't want to do the Zoom idea, but it sort of helped us, I think, get through that rough time of not being able to see each other.
And now being above 40, so even just from, I think, last year's numbers, we were still below 30, definitely below 35. And now we're up above 40, probably now approaching 50 members.
Well, we also, the last few years, have had a booth at the Washington State Quilt Show, which is a very big show here, which usually has about 600 quilts. And very much got recognized there because we kind of built our booth layering quilts upon quilts upon quilts upon quilts without separating them and hanging them all nice and straight. And so we were pretty bold in there. And, we not only were seen at the Jundt in 23, but we've been seen,
From
at
about the same time.
WSQ.
Yeah.
And at the time, the WSQ show year before, I think, we had 60 women come to our table and sign a form saying they wanted more information. And at the time I was president, and they, the people working with me said, "Oh my God, what do we do?" And I said, "Send an email to all 60 at once." And they were just like, "What?" And I said, "Let's just see what happens." And lucky for us, they trickled in, but they consistently came. But it wasn't this onslaught of 60 women all at once. So that was a good thing.
We were envisioning just like so many people that we couldn't even seat them in the room that we meet in. So a lot of people are interested. They have created a category for modern quilts in that show. And I think that really has been something that has drawn attention to the Guild. And we challenge each other. We always have a challenge that is for a category of quilts. We use the color of the year. So there's several organizations that do a color of the year. Pantone is one. And there's
some of the fabric companies.
Company that always does a color of the year, which is a unique color of solid fabric that they don't repeat. Pantone is more for like industry people, like designers and, clothing and home goods designers, interior design. And so they put out like a hex code for the color of the year. And then that gets translated into what fabric is the closest to that. This year it was Cloud Dancer, which is white.
It was white.
It was so disappointing.
We were all like, "Oh dear."
And everyone immediately went to political interpretation of that. And so we chose the Kona color this year, which is called Wander, and it's a bright green. So our quilts in the show this October will all feature some of that green. And we left our parameters kind of wide open this year. Sometimes we pick a pattern and say, use this pattern as your inspiration. We've done that in the past. This year we just said, represent 10 in any way you want to represent 10.
For our anniversary.
For our 10th anniversary as a guild. So we'll see what happens. We didn't specify a size. We kind of said, no smaller than, no bigger than. We'll see what happens when those all get hung together in the quilt show. And that really has that unifying thing where you can explain to people where these quilts came from. Here were the parameters. Here were the challenges. This is what you got. This array of quilts is what you got.
Well, I'm hoping that the Jundt show attracts some people who might be quilt curious, and that they're intrigued or encouraged to follow on from that. As we close, I just wonder if you feel as though anything needs explaining in the Jundt show. Like Mickey, with your piece, it seems like people are finding that on their own. Is there anything that you would want to explain to people as they're walking through this exhibition at the Jundt?
I think we talked about earlier, like Jane and I are very excited about modern quilting. And I think what it is for me is the use of color in a different way than you saw in traditional quilting. And the break the rules kind of thing that you don't see in traditional quilting. So I get excited about it, and
People should just go with an open mind.
Yeah.
Because really what I love about having now seen two shows at the Jundt is even for us to see our quilts hung in that setting changes how we look at our own work. Because it's really thrilling to be in that beautiful gallery space, and also to see how the curator or curators, how they made choices to what got hung next to each other. And the quilts literally have a way of the pieces of art, they like talk to each other. They have something in common. And it's because the curator's eye saw that, it allows you to see it. I don't think I would have hung that show in the way that it was hung at all.
I wouldn't have.
And so having someone else with an artistic background and an eye put those pieces together in the way that they did, it's a wonderful experience as an artist. And it's a wonderful thing, I think, for our guild to see ourselves through those eyes.
Yeah, it's very different than a quilt show. And I think that was always a goal for me, for our group, was how to expand outside of just the quilt show. And what would that look like? So it's exciting to have been in the Jundt, to be back. The hope is that we will return and keep returning. And next April, we're going to be at the Spokane Art School for an exhibition. So I like this pushing, again, breaking some rules. You don't have to just hang your quilt in a quilt show, but what is it going to be like if we are in, to me, one of the most beautiful galleries in Spokane is the Jundt.
Excellent. Well, before we totally wrap up, we're going to push the envelope when it comes to this conversation, because every interview closes with the lightning round.
Oh.
Yes. So hopefully this is a pleasant surprise. Now, the first question is always an either or. Sometimes I describe these as very unenviable choices because you wouldn't really want either, but you've got to go with one. This is a relatively enviable choice. And I don't know if one of you wants to go first. Mickey, Jane, who wants to be intrepid? Mickey's the more intrepid of the two. Okay. So this is an either or. Would you rather? Would you rather have all traffic lights you approach go green, so go in your favor, or never have to stand in line again?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's hard to pick because both seem pretty appealing.
Are we on it?
Imagine the Jeopardy theme tune playing right now.
I'm going to go with the lights being green.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure why.
I'm going to go for the line thing.
Oh.
Yeah. I go to the Gorge every year to see Dave Matthews Band and never stand in a line. Oh my goodness. That'd be lovely. And some of the lights are green anyway.
Yeah,